Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Emily Soul, and welcome to this week's Top 5 Podcast News Stories. Let's get into it. Let's talk about Epidemic Sounds. Epidemic Sound is partnering with podcast companies like Acast, Unwell Network, Realm, and many more to add music and sound effects to your favorite podcasts. These partnerships help creators use music without legal issues, allowing global distribution of their content, which I personally love as someone who has had to deal with the headache of trying to find royalty-free music. This sounds like an absolute game changer. 80% of content creators believe music is crucial for success, and 85% choose music to evoke special feelings to their audiences. And here is an example of the music library in Epidemic Sounds. And now I want to hear from you. Do you use any sort of royalty-free music in your podcast? If you do, comment down below. Now let's talk about the top podcast advertisers during the month of September. I wasn't too surprised by any of these brands. Amazon and BetterHelp were the top podcast advertisers in September. Amazon spent $7 million focusing on sport podcasts, while BetterHelp spent $7 million as well, increasing ads in the comedy podcast space. Other big advertisers were T-Mobile at $5.5 million, Shopify at $5 million, and MGM Resorts at $4.9 million, favoring mostly sports podcasters. Brands like Toyota, State Farm, and Disney also spent heavily on sports-focused shows. I'm personally starting to see a trend with all the sports podcasts. This could be because football season is starting, hockey season has also started, and baseball season is finally ending. Either way, congrats to all the sports podcasters because you guys are bringing in the big bucks right now. Now, enough with advertiser spending. Let's switch gears to talk about a podcast that's been turned into a TV show. Markiplier, who is a popular internet personality, created a TV show from his podcast, The Edge of Sleep. The show made it to Amazon Prime's video's most watched TV chart without backing from any traditional platforms. This just shows how creators can find success outside of the typical industry's channels. The Edge of Sleep was originally a popular podcast. It gained 6 million downloads, making it the biggest genre narrative podcast of its time. Its popularity as a podcast helped pave the way for its TV adaptation, showing how a strong podcast can be a launching pad for other media platforms. Markiplier leveraged his existing fan base for the adaptation as well. He brought in his 37 million YouTube subscribers to support the show. The TV version of The Edge of Sleep was created with 6 episodes on a super tight budget, yet it still found success, even though Hollywood initially rejected Markiplier because he was just a YouTuber. Not only does Markiplier have a successful TV show, he has also created another podcast called Distractables. A huge congratulations to Markiplier for making his podcast into a popular Amazon TV show. Now let's talk about how video podcasts are becoming even more popular. As video consumption grows, many podcast creators are adapting their content to include video elements to reach a broader audience. And a little bit of a plug, we are also a video podcast. So if you are an audio-only listener, go to our YouTube channel, look up MoPod, and you'll find me. And make sure to subscribe and like all of our videos. Enough with the plug, let's get back into the story. For example, Exactly Right Media invests in video production for its new studio. The company behind the popular show My Favorite Murder has equipped its Burbank, California studio with high-end audio gear and video equipment, including cameras, setup design, and specialized lighting. This shift shows how audio-focused companies are adapting to the demand of video content. Platforms like YouTube and TikTok are especially popular with younger audiences, pushing podcast creators to add a visual component to appeal to this demographic. Although some critics believe podcasts should remain an audio-only format, comparing video podcasts to video radio, seeing it as a misunderstanding of the medium's strength. But interview podcasts have been leading the way in video. Shows like the Joe Rogan Experience have long included video elements. Viewers actually appreciate being able to see the guests' reactions and mannerisms, adding depth to the interviews. YouTube has actually become the top platform for podcast listening in the US. Surveys show that 28% of podcast listeners use YouTube most often, surpassing Spotify at 15% and Apple Podcasts at 12%. This shift highlights YouTube's growing influence in the podcast industry. Also, YouTube's recommendation algorithm makes it more attractive for podcasters. The platform's ability to suggest videos based on users' interests help podcasts get discovered more easily compared to traditional audio platforms, which lack similar discovery tools. So why is this important? This shift towards video podcasts reflects broader changes in media consumption, especially among younger audiences. As YouTube becomes a leading platform for podcasts, creators need to adapt to stay relevant and reach new audiences. The trend also shows how media consumption habits have been evolving. However, it brings challenges for traditional audio creators and raises questions about maintaining the essence of podcasting. Now, let's talk about my favorite topic, the podcast of the week. The podcast of this week is the Celebrity Memoir Book Club, which, if you don't know, is a podcast with two comedians, Claire Parker and Ashley Hamilton, that read celebrity memoirs so you don't have to. All right, here's a little clip of the podcast.
Okay, this is actually one of my favorite stories that I heard him give in a different interview and has stuck with me as a creative. I share it with all of my creative freelance friends. I think this is one of the most powerful anecdotes in here, and I think it is so important if you're somebody that charges your own wage to hear. He talks about coming up as a stylist in Chicago. There was a girl trying to make it as an up-and-coming makeup artist, and they'd be booked on a lot of the same gigs. After a few years, he noticed he was seeing her less and less, so he reached out to her and said what happened, and she said, essentially, I wasn't able to make a financial go of it. And he's like, wow, you were so talented. And he said what he did was every time he completed a project, he said, well, now I have worked with one more person, done one more job, and I have that much more experience, and you need to pay for that experience. And every single time you work with him, his price goes up because he's a little bit better at his job. What she did is she was scared to raise her prices. And so people would say, well, I worked with you for $75 last time. And then other people go, well, she only paid $75. And because she established herself as the person who was too timid to charge more, she never found the courage to charge more, and she became what he calls the $75 girl, and she eventually was priced out of her own life. She was not keeping her prices up to date with even inflation, and she could no longer live in Chicago, and she had to give it up altogether. So he warns, do not become the $75 girl. People are paying for your experience and your expertise, and every time you grow, your price goes up. And of course, you can't break a contract or anything, but do not put yourself in a box, know your worth, and you demand it, and if people can't afford it, then you cannot work with them, but you're better off knowing that you're more valuable than just scramming for little things. Because look at pairs of jeans. If a pair of jeans says it's $500, people are like, oh, that must be a good pair of jeans. It does work. You have to say what you're worth.
And that is a wrap for this week's top podcasting news stories. Once again, I'm your host, Emily Soul. Thank you so much for tuning in. Make sure to subscribe, and I will see you guys next week. Bye.